well, if these groups are brainwashing, then why is it that they have such low retention rates? I think like the best longitudinal study of these groups, it shows that they have like a 0.05% retention rate. So people join and then they leave. Like my religion always ends up getting thrown in with these more extreme groups. Like you remember watching the Jubilee episode,
Hmm.
like John Dehlin did that. He 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 said he listed off, People's Temple and a bunch of those like very extreme groups. And then he said, if I thought of all the level of harm that these groups did, and then I think of like the level of harm that the LDS Church has done, it's done more harm than those groups. He said something that like that, which is ridiculous because those groups are so much smaller than our church. You got to look at the rate.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And in today's episode, I'm joined with Jacob Mayberry. Jacob, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're gonna discuss cults and address the criticism that is often leveled against the church, that the church is a cult, and we're gonna be discussing sort of what is a cult, and you're gonna be sort of critiquing the bite model by Stephen Haasan, and you've got a presentation prepared as well. But before we get into your presentation, you've been on my channel before when we had the panel discussion on the Fairview Temple. But for any listeners who didn't watch that, tell us like very quickly your bio, who you are, and you've also got a channel, I think, as well. So tell us about that.
Right. Yeah. My name is Jacob Mayberry. I'm originally from Arizona, born and raised in the church. I'm currently living in Magna, Utah. I'm a corrections officer at the Utah State Prison, or a prison guard, for those who don't know what a corrections officer is.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Not a dull day,
Yeah.
not a dull job.
For those who, I'm sure many of your listeners will know who Ruby Frankie is,
Yeah.
or who like Dan Lafferty is. I've met
Right. Yeah.
them.
Oh wow.
I've interacted with them. They're in the Utah State Prison. So
My goodness.
if you want to know what they're like, you can hit me up or message them, because I've especially interacted with Ruby Frankie and Jody Hildebrandt.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Um,
It's
but
hard to relate, although I feel like I work in a primary school, but there's some awful children there. So in some ways, I feel like a prison guard half the time as well.
yeah,
Never a dull day in that job either.
right.
So that's pretty
I
cool.
can't I can't say any more than that publicly, just because my like my higher ups might see this, but I can say that like I work with them. But yeah, I work in the Utah State Prison, and I do have a channel called Actual Mormons with Bridger Coburn. We haven't made anything lately, but we do plan on making stuff in the future, and we just make stuff defending the church. And
Right.
I have a master's degree in criminal justice and a bachelor's degree in psychology. So
Okay.
um, the since we're talking about cults, the criminal justice system does interact with, I guess if you want to call them cults, the more extreme cults that end up doing very, very violent things and end up hurting people, like People's Temple, like the Branch Davidians, like the Manson family.
Heaven's
Um,
Gate.
yeah, the criminal justice system interacts extensively with groups like that, and so in getting my master's degree, and I'm currently working in my PhD, I do receive a little bit of education on those groups.
Right. It's interesting how a lot of those cults seem to come from the States. What's wrong with the people there? They're all whack jobs.
Yeah,
Um,
so something in the water. Yeah,
and like, did you go on a mission as well?
yeah. I Spokane, Washington.
Okay. I'm sure, like, on your mission, like, I was given the criticism that we're part of a cult, and it's something that, outsiders would say about our church and some of the people that leave that we're part of a cult as well. And you're also going to be, critiquing the bite model by Stephen Hassan because people use some of the features he gives for a cult like either religion or group or organization. Behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control. And people see some of those features corresponding with aspects of the church and saying that there's cult like elements of the church. But like the first question I want to ask, and this probably isn't an easy answer, is what is a cult? Like, how do we define a cult?
It depends on who you ask, even if you're talking to experts. Like when like on my mission, I did receive that accusation, and then I asked this guy on the street, like, what's a cult? And he couldn't tell me. That like he tried really hard to define it, and I'm just like, you're accusing me of something. My church is something that you can't even define. And whenever people, like, quite often when people do try to give a definition, the purpose of a cult model is to distinguish between, nefarious organizations and regular organizations. And usually the characteristics they give, you can almost always say, well, you can find those characteristics in regular organizations too. And that's one of the reasons why they fall flat, is because it's like you can find those characteristics in the military and in the US government, in Walmart, in Coca-Cola. And so that's one of the reasons why, as I'll get into later, why they've been mostly rejected by mainstream academia, is because the scholars that have tried to come up with these models, um, other scholars that have critiqued them have said, no, you've really failed in with your model in distinguishing these organizations from other organizations that you don't consider cults. And so,
Right.
yeah, and it's really tricky trying to define them. But in one of my criminal justice textbooks that I read yesterday to try and brush up on this, um, is they defined it as just groups that try to separate themselves from the rest of society in an effort to hide what they're doing from the rest of society. If they're an apocalyptic cult, they quite often think that the end of the world is coming.
Hmm.
Um, that they're quite often doing things that the rest of society would frown upon. They're quite often doing illegal things. In the case of Warren Jeffs, marrying underage girls. Um, the most extreme cases, they're doing really really harmful things. And so if you want to
Right.
define it as a cult, as just a fringe group that is doing really shady harmful things, then I'm down with that. But it's when you really try to systematize cult models in the way that Stephen Hassan has and other cult scholars that you really start getting into problems.
Yeah, because I think usually what comes in my mind whenever I think of the word cult is usually like this small, kind of fringe, sinister, corrupt group, which is highly controlling or manipulative, whether or not it's religious or not. So you very much see it in a sinister way. Whenever I looked up in the dictionary what a cult is, it said a system of religious veneration and devotion directed towards a particular figure or object. And that definition of cult, I guess this would be probably older before all of these very harmful cults came about in like the last 50 years or so, is very generic and could apply to a lot of different religions, Islam or Christianity, as well as Mormonism, having a charismatic leader, that there's religious worship. You might have a sacred text and beliefs or a theology or rituals you follow. So in that sense, it's very broad. I know other definitions have referred to it as like a minority sort of group or religion, which is very much different from the mainstream religion. Others might see as a cult, or it's got very strange or peculiar beliefs as well.
Right. Yeah. Like, and the definitions that Stephen Hassan and other cult scholars have come up with, they include like those legitimately dangerous groups that harm people. but they also include groups that are just considered weird or fringe by the rest of society, but aren't necessarily harmful.
Mm.
And these models, because of this, they have the potential to stigmatize these latter groups that I just referred to, the ones that aren't harmful but are considered weird, because they end up painting with a broad brush and they end up grouping these groups that are considered weird but aren't harmful with these groups that are harmful. Um, and
Okay.
they end up, and there's a way, and there, it makes it very easy for people to use these models as just a tool to justify bigotry against groups that really don't deserve it.
Mm. Okay.
That's that is the biggest bone that a lot of scholars have to pick with these cult models, is that they just aren't valid enough to be able to adequately separate uh, groups that aren't harmful from ones that are.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that was one thing I found as I've been looking into is it's not easy to distinguish between a religion and a cult. And no, maybe later on towards the end I might get your thoughts on, different organizations or religions, or talk about is there maybe a spectrum, because I think we would agree some of the groups like Heaven's Gate or David Koresh's group, like they're pretty harmful. Like they would definitely fall under the definition of cult, but it's very hard to really give a definition that everything fits into neatly in a way. But why don't we begin with your presentation, and talk about the bite model and then your critiques. And I've got some listener questions as well that I'll try to throw in as well to this.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll just share my screen. This is a nice little PowerPoint I made. So the beginning, we're going to be talking mostly about brainwashing, mind control, coercive persuasion. It's basically the same thing going by different names. Stephen Haasan would say that brainwashing and mind control are two related but different things. But it, for the purposes of this discussion, both concepts have been rejected by the academic community for the most part.
Hmm.
Um, but uh, different scholars have different names for it. Some call it coercive persuasion, some call it coercive control. Um, they quite often rename it and then claim that they've refined their theories, when in reality they've just changed the name. And so, um, so I'm going to be doing a lot of appealing to authority in this presentation. Um,
As in like the academic consensus.
Yeah, right. And so I might be accused of committing a fallacy, and so just to kind of nip that at the bud at the beginning, I just want to say that appealing to authority, this is not a fallacy as long as it meets these two criteria. The authority, he or she must have gained his or her expertise in a way that is publicly demonstrable and replicable by others. Others must be able to obtain the same expertise and arrive at the same conclusions if they so desire. And two, the authority must contribute to a consensus of experts if an expert's observations are open to public scrutiny and his or her conclusions are replicable, a consensus of opinion will form. And so I'm going to be appealing to this consensus, and I'm going to be citing a bunch of books and scholarly articles. If people want to read them, they can do that. But I'm not going to be getting too much into the weeds. I'm mostly going to be appealing to these authorities.
So are these like sociologists, psychologists? Are these the sort of callers that you're appealing to?
Sociologists, psychologists, religious studies scholars, historians. It's a wide array of different scholars.
Okay.
Um, the two main books that I'm relying on are these two. So, a historical introduction to the study of new religious movements by Michael Ashcraft. This is considered the definitive historical study of new religious movements, which is the more academic term for cults. It's the more accepted term, new religious movements. Um, and it does a really good job at talking about the kind of power struggle between two different camps of scholars, which is the cultic studies scholars and the new religious movement scholars.
Hmm.
Uh, Stephen Haasan is part of the cultic studies camp, and then the new religious movement scholars, which I'll get into later. Um,
So
they
some
they have
scholars use the word cult as sort of interchangeable for a new religious movement or sort of a smaller religious movement.
yes, yes, and they tend to the cultic studies scholars. They tend to have a lot more animosity towards these groups, and they, in my opinion, they are much less objective when studying these religions. I'll get into them later in the next slide. But then this next book, it's just simply a brainwashing reality or myth by Massimo Introvigne. He is a sociologist and social historian. It's a pretty short book, a little over 80 pages, but it's really good at going over the concept of brainwashing, um, and how, I'll go into it later, but um, basically, he at the very beginning of the book, he talks about how um, different concepts throughout the history of the world. People have tried to whenever an unpopular group or religious group pops up in society, people come up with a concept to explain why this group believes in what they believe in. So during the medieval period, they would try to use demons. These people are possessed by demons. That no rational person could believe in this, so they must be possessed by demons. And then during the 1800s, it was mesmerism. These no rational person could believe in this, so they must be under the influence of mesmerism. And then in the 1900s, then it became brainwashing. And it, if you'll remember, the Fawn Brody, she even kind of used this explanation where she said that Joseph Smith had the unconscious ability to make people see visions, and she even used the mesmerism explanation.
Mm.
Um, but
Unconscious hypnotist in a way.
yes, hypnotism, mesmerism, and so he kind of says that there's the the explanation of brainwashing is really no different. It's just whenever an unpopular religious group comes into a society, the dominant group, their assumption is that no possible rational person could believe in this. So we have to come up with this concept to explain why they believe in it. And so there's been different explanations throughout history. Today it's brainwashing, but in the past it was demons. Now it's brainwashing.
How would you distinguish between indoctrination versus brainwashing?
Indoctrination is usually referred to children.
Right.
That's in the context of children. Um, whereas brainwashing is usually referred to adults, but although they can be used interchangeably.
Hmm.
Um, and the difference between indoctrination and teaching your kids good principles, there's not really much difference. It's
Right.
just I like this and I don't like this.
Yeah.
Um,
It can have a negative connotation too, but brainwashing is seems a lot more extreme. Like somebody's totally warped your mind and you've lost your rational faculties.
yeah, yeah, that's what they try to say that, but I'll say that I'll get into it in the future in a future slide. But
Okay.
uh, the difference between brainwashing and persuasion, there's not the difference between that isn't all that clear.
Hmm.
Um, so those are the two books you can rely on. These two journals you can rely on. These are two scholarly journals. The Journal of Cesner, or the Center for Studies on New Religions, and then the Journal of Nova Religio. Um, these are two excellent scholarly journals that you can go to. And I will also be citing journals in this presentation. So now I'll get into the difference between cultic studies and new religious movement studies. So both fields of study, um, they both study new and emerging secular and religious groups that are viewed with suspicion by the wider society. But new religious movement studies tries to study these movements objectively and scientifically by observing how they start, form, recruit, grow, change, and react to outside pressures over time. Cultic studies, on the other hand, hyper focuses on studying how these groups harm their members and society. And this is a list of the scholars that are affiliated. This is an exhaustive list, but you got for cultic studies, you got John Clark, Richard Delgado, Arthur Dole, Linda Dubrow Marshall, Steve Enroth, Lorna Goldberg, William Goldberg, David Halperin, Stephen Kent, Michael Langone, Richard Offshay, Daniel Shaw, Margaret Singer, and Stephen Haasan. Um, I don't know if some might recognize Richard Delgado. He's also one of the architects of critical race theory and critical legal studies, I think.
Okay.
But um, new religious movement scholars, you got guys like Dick Anthony, William Bainbridge, Eileen Barker, James Beckford, David Bromley, Gordon Milton, James Richardson, Anson Shoup, Rodney Stark, Douglas Cohen, Eugene Gallagher, Massimo Intervigne, Stuart Wright, Gene Rosenfeld, Braun Taylor, Jeffrey Kaplan, and Benjamin Zeller. So, which field is more respected by the wider academic community? Now, this is a quote from the one of the books I shared by Michael Ashcraft, The Historical Introduction to the Study of New Religious Movements. This is a direct quote from that book. It says, Cultic studies is not mainstream scholarship. It is largely the project shared by a small cadre of committed scholars. They share their agenda with anti-cult activists, but the larger academic community, nationally and internationally, does not recognize cultic studies as the field that provides modern society with the most reliable information and interpretation of new religious movements. That distinction goes to NRM studies, or New Religious Movement Studies. So
Okay. So is that statement, are they saying, do they think cultic studies don't provide the most reliable information or interpretation of new religious movements because are they basically saying their bias is they're wanting to highlight the the problems or the issues with these new religious movements and they're not looking at them objectively, or why do you think he's making that point?
they tend to have an axe to grind. That's their activist scholars is basically his point.
Mm,
And they're a hammer in search of a nail, and so they're just trying to find uh, something wrong with these groups quite often. And as I'll get into in future slides, the new religious movement studies they focus on the perspectives of everyone within these groups. They view those perspectives equally. So they the people who stay in these groups, people who leave, they view those perspectives equally. Whereas cultic studies scholars they tend to prioritize the perspectives of people who leave, and not just people who leave, but people who left and had a really bad experience. Those are the only people whose perspectives are valid,
mm,
and you'll quite often encounter that opinion among like diehard ex-Mormons too, is that it's the people who left that they're the ones who are the most objective when it comes to talking about Mormonism. If you want to know about Mormonism, you got to look at the ex-Mormon channels. Don't listen to the faithful members. They won't give you the most reliable perspective on Mormonism. I'm sure you've heard that, right?
right. Yeah, of course.
Um, and so that is quite often the perspective of cultic studies is they have a major axe to grind. They're activists, and they they're just not very objective. That's the perspective that's being pushed here.
Mm, okay.
Any more questions on that?
No, I guess like so you're saying new religious movement scholars, they're more just trying to look at yeah, everyone's different views on the religion, insiders, outsiders, trying to understand the religion more as opposed to trying to point out all the say issues or harmful elements of it. And you're saying that the cultic scholars are more focused on just highlighting the issues with some of these religions or groups as cults.
Yeah. And then the new religious movement scholars, they're just more focused on studying how these groups form, grow, and react to outside society over time. Just they're just trying to be scientists.
Hmm. Now, can I ask like maybe a wee bit of a pushback? Because someone might say, and I even agree with this to an extent, that with these harmful groups or organizations where there are things like, rape, abuse, or even murder, or like, really bad control manipulation, someone might feel that there should be scholars who are pointing out the problems or these are some warning signs to avoid. Like it's good to be made aware of like some of these culture groups around. So what if somebody were to push back and say that it's good that we have some scholars focusing on the dark side of religious groups or organizations? What do you think about that?
Well, the new religious movement scholars, they have said that they don't really have much of a problem with these cultic uh, study scholars if they just operated more as like a watchdog against the groups that are legitimately harmful,
Right, the more
um,
extreme.
the more extreme ones, and just tried to call them out when they are doing harmful things, they wouldn't have a problem. But when the cultic study scholars try to create concepts like pseudoscientific concepts like brainwashing and these cult models that we'll get into later, and try to give them the veneer of scientific credibility, and then they end up applying those to other groups that aren't harmful, that's when they start having a problem.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's where the rivalry between these two groups starts happening, because the new religious movement scholars, they acknowledge that there are groups that are legitimately harmful, and they've written about that, but they just don't make that the sole focus of their study.
Okay, okay.
But these are a few articles that have been put out on the concept of brainwashing. This is about the brainwashing controversy of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Um, and actually, I think this might be a good time to get into that video that that I wanted to share.
Oh yes, okay. Is this the one of Dan McLellan?
Yeah, it's Dan McLellan, and then there's another scholar named Dr. Hillel Gray, and then another one named David Frankfurter that actually showed up on the Mormon Stories podcast.
Okay. I've not seen
So
this clip before, so this will be fresh for me.
yeah, so the Dan McLellan goes into the history of the brainwashing controversy of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then I'll kind of elaborate more on that history.
Okay.
Hey everybody, I continue to see a lot of discussion on social media about cults, and I just want to remind you all that this is not a legitimate scholarly framework. Cult, brainwashing, mind control, deprogramming, these things were all abandoned by scholars back in the early 90s after the courts asked cult experts to substantiate their methods and their findings, and they failed entirely. This is why the only scholars you will see publishing on the concept of cult these days are scholars from the 80s who are trying to remain relevant. So Stephen Hassan's BITE model was developed back in 88. It was abandoned by scholars along with everything else, but after 9/11, after the rise of Trump, these scholars try to ride that wave of populist anxiety back into the public eye. And this is harmful for a number of reasons, and not least of which it complicates our attempts to understand what's actually going on with these groups that are causing significant harm.
Okay. Right,
Hey,
succinctly
happy to
said.
elaborate. The conceptualization of cult that I critique in my video is a product of the 1960s and the development of two social movements in tandem that were made up of parents who were upset about their teenage and adult children running off into the woods with hippies to talk about weird stuff. In the Christian community, you had the counter-cult movement. In the non-religious community, you had the anti-cult movement. And one of their priorities was finding a way to assert control over their adult children who could join any groups they wanted. And what they did to facilitate that was went to long since debunked research about Korean War POWs and how they had to have been brainwashed and been under mind control to sympathize with their captors. This has long since been debunked, but the counter and anti-cult movement gladly took up that research and said people who join with these weirdos in the woods cannot be of sound mind. They must have been brainwashed. They are under mind control. This allowed them to get medical professionals involved. It allowed them to commit people. It allowed them to take over control of the lives of their adult children, which was the goal all along. Now, because brainwashing isn't real, deprogramming, their method of reversing the effects of brainwashing, also wasn't real. So they were constantly having to escalate their techniques to try to make it work. And this resulted in the 80s with a bunch of kidnappings, with sexual abuse, with electroshock therapy, and a lot of harmful behavior that mirrored what they were criticizing in the cults themselves. So scholars began to become alarmed. They started to investigate the foundations of these frameworks and found out that there was nothing there. There was no scientific basis to brainwashing, to mind control. And the bottom fell out. The courts stopped allowing them to use brainwashing and mind control as a way to absolve themselves of responsibility for their actions. And by 1995, these movements were all but defunct, which is why you don't see scholars these days talking about cults and mind control, except for scholars like Stephen Haasan from the 80s trying to relive the glory days. The rise of Trump increased interest among lay people and society in general about cults, and this allowed him to ride that populist wave into a PhD program where he finally wrote his dissertation and got his PhD in 2020, even though the bite model dates to the 80s. Now, this is not to say that such groups were not capable of harmful behavior and that there were not power dynamics and different techniques of manipulation that led to harmful behavior. There were absolutely such harmful behaviors, but the dynamics associated with them are not found in this conceptualization of cult. They're much broader, and we need to do better to understand them.
There's a few of these, so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not true, my friend.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It doesn't mean every single person who is a scholar agrees, but it is overwhelmingly the consensus, and the argument is sound.
Here's a class you can take at Harvard University on cult psychology.
Yes, universities, including Harvard, still have courses like this on the books. These are courses that the university has and assigns to professors who, for the most part, are not specialists in this and are teaching it only because they're capable of teaching this. And for instance, if you go look at the professors who teach this course at Harvard and have taught it in the past and look at their CVs, you will not find the word cult anywhere in their publications or in their research. They tend not to be specialists in new religious movements. But if you look at the specialists in new religious movements that Harvard does have, you will find them saying cult is an outdated term. We don't use this. Deprogramming, brainwashing are not a thing. However, we do recognize that a lot of people use cult because that it helps them make sense of their past experiences. And so they will respect that term even though they don't prefer it, they don't use it in the scholarship, and they don't think of it as a legitimate scholarly framework. So it's a lot more complicated than this. I am sharing the overwhelming academic consensus. I am not telling you every last scholar on the planet believes this, and if anyone doesn't, they're lying.
The only people who don't think it's a legitimate study are people in cults. Like if you belong to the Mormon church. Which, let's get real, that's what this is really about, right?
No, that's not remotely what this is about, but I understand that that is an easy assumption to make. I am sharing the overwhelming academic consensus. You can look at a bunch of resources to find this out. You can look at the journal Nova Religio. You can look at the International Journal for the Study of New Religions. You can go look at the Oxford Handbook of New Religious Movements. Rutledge has a whole series on new religious movements. Cambridge does as well. You can find all kinds of scholarship out there that demonstrates what I'm sharing is the scholarly consensus. But to suggest that because Harvard has a course with the word cult in the title and in the course description, means that no one thinks this is an inappropriate scholarly category except for those who are in cults is just laughably lazy. Please do better.
Perhaps I should be flattered that you called me a cult apologist, and I wouldn't bother responding except sometimes on social media if you say something enough people start to believe it. Scholars refrain from disparaging or condemning religious groups, and that's why we use a term like new religious movement rather than cult. Scholars don't deny that there can be abuse, manipulation, and corruption in all sorts of new religious movements, as well as older religious movements. Cult is a poorly defined, biased term that is associated with some outdated, even unscientific notions, like brainwashing. I'm not an apologist for my own religion, so I'm certainly not going to be one for new religious movements. When it comes to publishing in academic journals and doing scientific research, I'm confident that the scholars in new religious movements outnumber by far those who are in the anti-cult movement. So there isn't parity between these two groups. I'm not doubting that you have suffered from your family's involvement in the Unification Church, but I want to show you that there are plenty of religious scholars who do study the Unification Church without calling them a cult, and so I'll show you some images from the articles that have been published in recent years.
The other thing that came out in the 60s was a resurgence of anxiety about so-called brainwashing. Now, brainwashing has no psychological basis, but it arose during the Korean War as a way of fomenting fears about POWs. But this was given a whole new life with during the 60s and 70s with the deprogrammer movement. That is, experts in evil, in this case, experts who could kidnap your child from a group and subject your child to extreme deprivation and violence in order to convince him or her that they shouldn't be part of the group. And the idea was that what they claimed, the deprogrammers, was that they were breaking the brainwashing that the group did. Brainwashing became an important aspect of the satanic ritual abuse claims. The idea was that these rituals functioned to hypnotize and brainwash the abuse victims. So not only were they victims of sexual abuse, they were victims of programming and deprogramming, programming and brainwashing. So I would say that was one major thread that came into SRA. And the other was the notion of the cult itself. The cult as a kind of folk model of dangerous religion. I don't use the word cult when I teach, and even when I teach about new religious movements, I don't let I try to get the students away from the word cult. I tell them at a certain point that they have to learn not to use the word cult because it's
polarizing, divisive.
It's derogatory, and of course, LDS members will know that, in the broader evangelical society, LDS is viewed as a cult. It's really a word that means any form of religion that is
that you don't like.
Yeah, you don't like. Exactly.
A cult is a religion I don't like.
Exactly. Yes.
That last video, I just think it's ironic that John DeLynn is kind of nervously chuckling along with that since he's promoted cult models and Stephen Haasan so much. But
well, when was that interview on Mormon Stories?
I don't remember. John DeLynn did a series on satanic ritual abuse. He was debunking it. He invited David Frankfurter, who is a historian on that. But in the process, David Frankfurter ended up, kind of talking bad about cult models. That wasn't the purpose of the interview. I don't think that John really wanted him to do that. But but it is kind of ironic that that's what ended up happening.
But this would have been after John would have had Stephen Haasan on his show to talk about the bite model.
No, I'd have to look at the date of when that happened. But
okay, so it could be before. So if you were to summarize what Dan McLellan was saying and what this scholar was saying as well about like using cults and what some of these cult scholars what they're promoting? Like, how would you summarize that?
Well, I can actually elaborate on it.
Okay, good.
Um, so these, if you want to actually go more in depth on what they said, these are some excellent articles that you can read. But basically, um, there are a bunch of unpopular groups like Scientology, Unification Church, or the Moonies, as they're called, or the Family International,
I think
where
Stevie Hassan was part of the Moonies, wasn't he?
he
I
was,
remember that
yes.
whenever he shared his story, and that probably is what inspired him in a way to come up with the bite model.
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of anti-cult scholars are former members of these groups.
Hmm.
That's something I've noticed. Um, or they have family members who were. But a lot of these articles go into the history of it. But basically, you had a lot of these former members of these groups or families of the former members who were suing these groups, claiming that um, these people didn't join these groups of their own free will and choice. They were under the influence of brainwashing or mind control,
Right.
and
Which takes
and,
away
and
their own responsibility, their
right,
ownership in a way.
right, and so they use these expert witnesses, these cult scholars, to defend them in these court cases, and so a lot of these articles are written in response to that, and I really like it because some of these articles they show that like, oh well, if these groups are brainwashing, then why is it that they have such low retention rates? I think like the best longitudinal study of these groups, it shows that they have like a 0.05% retention rate. So people join and then they leave, like
Right. Because if
real
they were
quick.
brainwashed, then they'd be brainwashed into staying and they would never leave. But if people are leaving, it means that that their mental rational faculties are still there, that they're
Yes,
making the decision. Their own.
there's definitely agency involved there,
Right.
and the people who are staying there because they want to stay and that they're very dedicated to the group. Um, but I think it's the social psychological critique of brainwashing claims. That's the one that goes into the what I'm talking about. The recruitment is like, if they're truly brainwashing, then why do they have such terrible retention? And groups like ours who have great retention, it isn't because like we're so great at brainwashing. It's because like we're actually appealing to our members, to the people who are joining. Whereas those groups, they did some shady stuff that made it to where people didn't want to join, and so that's why they had um, such low retention. And eventually, many of them kind of fizzled out, or they're just kind of a shadow of what they used to be.
So is the scholarly
Um,
consensus that really we shouldn't be using the terms brainwashing, even when people are joining what we would consider to be harmful groups or cults, even though maybe we shouldn't even use the word cult per se, but should we just not be using the word brainwashing?
Correct. Yeah, they don't even think it exists. Short of using like actual physical coercion or threats of physical coercion, um, they the scholarly consensus is that it's really difficult to pin down, um, actual the psychological coercion on people. It's really difficult to tell the difference between persuasion and brainwashing. And so,
Right,
like,
right.
how do you tell the difference? Like,
Yeah, like for example, what came to my mind is, people might say that you need to say go to church and, keep your covenants and the commandments, stay true and faithful so you can be with your family in the next life. For example, some might say like that's really manipulative or brainwashing, shall we say. But how do you distinguish that between, as you said, persuasion or people just relating their sincere beliefs? Or take like say Christianity, if you're a Christian and you have a child who like no longer believes, and you say to them like, unless you believe in Jesus, like you won't be in heaven with us, and that could be considered by some as like emotionally manipulative. But then how do you distinguish that from someone just sharing um what their beliefs are in a way.
Well, when you really push people on it, it's you basically get them to say like it's coercive because it's not true. Like, okay, well, I believe it's true, and so like it all comes down to whether or not you believe it's true, and um, so if that's what it depends on whether it's coercive or not, then it's not really about whether it's like you're actually using coercion. It's just about whether it's true or not. And
Well,
so
I know one person asked a question is quite a good one because somebody they asked like, could you come back to like say coercion or like manipulation, shall we say? Could it still be coercion or manipulation even if you're doing it with good intentions? If that makes sense, you're not doing it to manipulate for your own benefit. You're doing it for good motives, but could it still be classified as coercive?
if you're using physical coercion, yeah, the only way you can make it like clear cut is if you're using physical coercion or threats of physical coercion. That's the only way it's clear cut. But once you start trying to pin down whether it's psychological coercion, that's where these social scientists start having problems. Like it's very difficult to tell the difference between persuasion and coercion, and so they just say don't try.
Right. Okay.
Because it all depends on what your values are and whether or not you believe in the whether you believe it's true what you're trying to push, and whether you actually believe in the goals and values of the organization you're a part of.
Okay.
But so now we'll get into the nitty gritty of what actually happened in these court cases. So once these cases made it into the court cases, once these court cases made it into the courts, these expert witnesses, these cult scholars, they started they filed these briefs saying that these people were being brainwashed by these religious groups, and so the American Psychological Association actually came in and weighed in, as well as the American Sociological Association. Now, what's important here is that the sociologists already were agreed that brainwashing was bunk, but cult scholars have always had a kind of more of a foothold in psychology and psychiatry than they have in other disciplines. And so the fact that the American Psychological Association weighed in on this was huge. And so there were several scholars that were a part of this task force for the American Psychological Association that had a few of these things to say. So these are some quotes from some of the articles that I cited earlier. So in the U.S. legal system, an amicus curiae is an independent entity or individual who spontaneously submits to the court's elements that it believes may be relevant to resolve a case. On the 10th of February, 1987, the APA and others filed an amicus curiae brief on the Mokel case. The brief stated that the theory Margaret Singer had labeled coercive persuasion. Margaret Singer was a heavy hitter in the cult studies community, and Stephen Haasan, much of his work is based upon her work. If you read his dissertation, he cites her a lot. And coercive persuasion is basically synonymous with brainwashing. But they said that Margaret Singer, her theory, coercive persuasion, is not accepted in the scientific community, and that the corresponding methodology has been repudiated by the scientific community. The brief went on to specify that the choice of labels among brainwashing, mental manipulation, and coercive persuasion, always in the meaning used by Singer, was irrelevant, for none of those theories could be considered scientific. And then another scholar, Dr. Jeffrey Fisher, wrote that the report is unscientific in tone and biased in nature, sometimes characterized by the use of deceptive, indirect techniques of persuasion and control, the very thing it is investigating. At times, the reasoning seems flawed to the point of being almost ridiculous. Fisher added that the historical excursion on the cults reads more like hysterical ramblings than a scientific task report. Fisher commented that the reasoning becomes absolutely some of the most polemical, ridiculous reasoning I've ever heard, I've ever seen anywhere, much less in the context of an APA technical report. And then an Israeli scholar, Dr. Benjamin Biet Halamni, I'm sure I butchered his name. He was a scholar that was sympathetic to the anti-cult camp. He didn't like these groups,
Right.
but he ended with a radical conclusion. He said, the term brainwashing is not a recognized theoretical concept and is just a sensationalist explanation more suitable to cultists and revival preachers. It should not be used by psychologists since does not explain anything.
Mm.
And
I
then
think that's well stated. It does sound quite it is quite sensational and very controversial, very divisive in a way, but it's not scientific and it shouldn't be used by psychologists or psychiatrists.
Correct. And then lastly, according to Dr. Catherine Grady, the coercive persuasion techniques used in the task force estimate by the religious movements are not defined and cannot be distinguished from methods used in advertising, elementary schools, mainline churches, Alcoholics Anonymous, and Weight Watchers. And that last part is very important. I'm sure you remember the Jubilee episode where there was Mormons and ex-Mormons.
Yes.
So Cardin, he makes this very point, is that according to the Bite model, my show choir would be considered a cult. And that's the point that Dr. Grady is making here, is that according to this model that Margaret Singer is putting forth, this brainwashing model that she's putting forth, these are the same methods that many therapists use, that they use in AA and Weight Watchers to get their clients to do what they want. The only difference
similar in schools as well.
Yeah,
working in primary school to get the children to follow rules and do what the teacher wants them to do.
The only difference is that they're trying to get them to do things that these cult scholars agree with, and so there's nothing wrong with it in that context. But because the cults are doing things that they don't agree with,
they see as harmful.
That they see as harmful. These brainwashing techniques are magically bad in those contexts. And so that they just raked them through the coals, basically. And this was in 1987, but this is the standing consensus today, even now. After this happened, this kept on happening through the 90s and even into the early 2000s, where these court cases similar to this kept on happening. And eventually Margaret Singer and her fellow scholars, they ended up just coming to the conclusion that the academic community was conspiring against them, and that the only possible reason why they would be saying this about their work was because there was some conspiracy against them. And so they ended up breaking off from mainstream academia and creating their own journals, their own scholarly community, where they would just publish amongst themselves. And to this day, you'll even hear Stephen Haasan, like if you read his tweets and things that he says that there's like this conspiracy to suppress his work and the work of his fellow scholars. They don't want to accept that the possibility that the reason why their work has been rejected is because their work just isn't good. The only possible reason that it's being rejected is because there's some conspiracy against them. And so
so it was rejected by the US legal system, the courts, as well as the mainstream scholarly consensus among religious scholars and sociologists, psychologists.
Yes, the American Psychological Association is most important because whenever I've often said that, like, told people, like, when talking about this, that like mainstream academia rejects it, they'll try to often say, well, it's only rejected among religious studies scholars, historians, and sociologists, but not by psychiatrists and psychologists. And they'll try to often portray it as kind of like this turf war between different disciplines. But when you realize that the best and reigning psychological organization in the US said this stuff about it, like, you realize that there's no discipline that really respects this model. And this is important because brainwashing and mind control is really the backbone behind all of these cult models.
Mm. Okay.
So now we'll get into some critiques of Stephen Haasan specifically in his work. So here's a quote from Stephen Haasan's dissertation. It says, although the bite model has served people for 30 years, it was created in 1988 to exit controlling relationships and groups. This is the first quantitative study. Doing this quantitative study offers a scientific basis that might prove useful for examining undue influence in judicial settings. So within the field of psychology and social sciences in general, usually before a theory or an idea is taken seriously, it has to be subjected to like several quantitative studies, replicated several times. It has to be subjected to a meta-analysis or like a systematic review. But here, like Stephen Haasan is admitting that his dissertation, which was conducted in 2020, is the first time that his model has been subjected to a quantitative study, even though it's been around since 1988. Before that, the only study it has been subjected to was qualitative interviews of people that have left new religious movements, just him interviewing people. That's it. And usually in my field of criminal justice and criminology, before we ever take anything seriously, it has to be, you study, you do quantitative studies of large groups of people, representative samples, and you replicate, you make sure that it's not just a one-off or a fluke, and you do it over and over and over again. But here you see that his theory has not been subjected to that type of scrutiny. And the field of psychology has been, it's been raked through the coals in the last few years because of the replication crisis. It's been accused of being a pseudoscience because again, the replication crisis and so many problems within the social sciences, because it's just not as rigorous as the hard sciences. And so to see this being taken seriously when we already have so many problems within the field of psychology, it just shows like it's just kind of scary that his model is being taken so seriously when it hasn't been subjected to very much scrutiny.
Okay.
And then I don't want to name him, but I do know someone who attended Harvard in the religious studies department, and he actually interacted with Stephen Haasan. And these are direct quotes of what Stephen Haasan said to him. He said, this is a direct quote from Haasan. He said, Massimo Intervigne et al. Are cult apologists and propagandists. No one should read or trust their work. Now, Massimo Intervigne is the guy who wrote that book on brainwashing that I talked about earlier. And he's basically saying that all the new religious movement scholars who rejected his work, they're just cult apologists and propagandists. That's just not how you...
As in he's saying that they're just trying to defend these cult-like organizations, basically.
Yeah, that's a common accusation from cult scholars. It's just that the new religious movement scholars are just cult apologists. Even though that,
that's one thing I wanted to sorry, I just wanted to clarify is they're not defending these groups that would engage in very harmful practices that are highly manipulative or controlling, but it's more critiquing his model applying to cults and brainwashing. Like it's more that's been unsubstantiated. Like they're not saying that all these groups like Heaven's Gate are totally fine. It's not that, but it's more the model he's proposing to I guess classify what falls under a cult.
I think he does interpret like their critique of his model as them defending those cults, and sometimes like the new religious movement scholars, even when it comes to those very, very harmful groups, like the Westboro Baptist Church or the Westboro Baptist Church, I don't think they've done anything like violent, but they are like they're very cantankerous, and they've done and said some very terrible things. And even the violent ones, the new religious movement scholars, their approach is, even though these groups are harmful, we still need to study them objectively, and we need to study like 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 how they got to this point. And sometimes that approach can be uh, seen as, kind of giving them a pass. I don't know, especially from someone who only wants to see them as bad. If you trying to understand someone can sometimes be misunderstood as like trying to understand their perspective, their point of view, like trying to understand the point of view of a murderer. Can be sometimes be misunderstood as trying to give them a pass, or trying to excuse them, which I don't think that's what these scholars are trying to do. But from the perspective of someone like Haasan, I think that's what he sees it as.
And like, what if like someone like Stephen Haasan or these cultic scholars might see it as, okay, we're not trying to say like it's either a cult or it's not a cult, but say he's got this model and he sees it as like a spectrum. So there's certain groups that fall maybe more on the spectrum as like these are more harmful, shall we say, cults, and then other groups might be like these are have more like cult like tendency. Like, is the criticism that it's trying to like lump everything into like this one model? Because I could see someone pushing back, being like, well, maybe he's just giving these characteristics, and this is like a spectrum, shall we say?
Hey, he does try to make it into a spectrum. Like he obviously doesn't think that we are the same level as, say, Heaven's Gate,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
he still gets criticized by these new religious movement scholars for painting with a broad brush, um, and making the characteristics of his model are basically just him conflating his own progressive humanist values with what a good religion should look like.
Mm,
That's
right.
one criticism that I've heard leveled at him. Like he hasn't actually proved that a lot of these religions are harmful. It's just, oh, your religion doesn't meet like my progressive humanist values, so therefore it's bad. That's a lot of what the bite model is.
Right. So when it talks about things like, say, with behavior control, like if there's any dietary restrictions or sacred clothing to wear or regulations with regards to sexual activity, that's a cult, and these new religious movement scholars are seeing that as sort of problematic.
Yeah, like if you're that a lot of those rules, like those dietary restrictions and restrictions on sexual activity, that's just traditional conservative religions in
Religion.
general.
Yeah.
Yeah, and from my perspective, it's like, so what? A lot of those, I can show plenty of studies that show that those restrictions actually promote good things. They promote self
Sure. Yeah.
control, and they promote a lot of pro social behavior. They promote stable communities and societies,
It's
and
almost like to
so
say, who are you to say that those are harmful things or characteristics of like a harmful organization or a cult? And like you say, like some of those things would exist across different religions: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, what have you.
yeah, I mean, and one of the characteristics of the bite model is that it tells you who to marry and where to marry. And our religion tells, like, they strongly encourage us to marry people who are of our own religion. They tell us to marry in the temple. And I guess he would think that's bad, and that would check a box, so that we're part of the bite model in that regard. And I'm just like, so what? There are plenty of studies that show that it's people who marry um, a spouse who is of the same religion, same political orientation, who just have the same values in general, are less likely to divorce. And so it's typically a good idea to marry people who are the same religion as you. And so it's a good thing that the church tells you to marry someone who is also a member of the church. And so, like, he's basically just saying, I don't like that your church teaches that. He hasn't really proven that it's harmful. And so his model doesn't really predict harm. That's another thing. It doesn't predict harm at all.
Okay.
And this one part, another thing he told my informant who was at Harvard. So my informant, he was a student of Diana Eck, who is a professor of comparative religion at Harvard. Haasan said, "Oh, you work with Diana Eck? I offered to present on mind control for her, but she said she wasn't at all interested in my work. So there's that. I always get frustrated with religious scholars, or really anyone who refused to understand the sociological and psychological dimensions of mind control from a scientific perspective." So here you see, like, a respected scholar at Harvard doesn't take his work seriously, and he refuses to really introspect and engage with why he's not taken seriously. He just kind of just wonders and as to why he's not taken seriously. Just kind of interesting. Not much introspection there as to why he's not taken seriously at all. And here's a few other critiques of him by other scholars. So sociologist David G. Bromley called Haasan's whole goal a moral crusade, and said, "You get people who are caught up in trying to change themselves, become a new person, or build a new world, and they lose touch with who they are. And that isn't to say some groups don't take advantage of that process, but I don't think it's necessarily the case that they need someone like Haasan to come in with predetermined answers to their life problems." And that's one of the problems. Haasan used to be part of the Cult Awareness Network, and that group did some very problematic things. Dan McLellan did talk about how they tried to do deprogramming, which involved some very, very physically coercive things to try and get people to deprogram the brainwashing, which involved a lot of
what exactly does that involve?
It involves some like sexual abuse. It involved like locking people in these rooms, like where they couldn't leave. If you read some of those papers, yeah, it involved kidnapping them from the groups.
So and this is part of deprogramming or like rehabilitation.
Yeah, they would, like, in the most extreme cases, they would kidnap them from these groups and just basically lock them in a room until they had been fully rehabilitated. And yeah, it was very sketchy. I don't think Haasan necessarily participated in that stuff directly, but he was part of that group and he did do some very sketchy things. Now he does what is called exit counseling, which is basically just a therapy session where he does try to get people to leave these groups. And there are many therapists who do consider that to be unethical, because usually in a therapy session, you're just trying to explore with your client, like how to best help them. Whereas in these exit counseling, you have a predetermined goal to get them to leave.
You're trying to get them out of this religion or this group.
Yeah. And that's not seen as ethical by many therapists. Right. And then there's another quote by a religious studies professor, Eugene Gallagher, in his book, The New Religious Movement's Experience in America. He says, these explicit and implicit generalizations and these cult models tend to foster, outside of an implicit mainstream, tend to foster, whether intended or not, generalized suspicion of all leaders who stand outside of an implied mainstream. Such generalized suspicion is a major analytical principle of anti-cult activists like Haasan and Singer. When raised to a higher level of generality, well-founded criticism of a few leaders is extended to all leaders with a corresponding loss of specificity, accuracy, and persuasiveness. Such overgeneralization ignores the abundant diversity of leadership forms of new religions on the assumption that all cults must be the same.
Can you just briefly summarize what he was saying?
So he's basically saying that there's a well-founded criticism of some leaders that basically just gets extended to
all,
to basically any leader that falls within these models. And Haasan might deny that he tries to say that his model is nuanced, but anytime I have a conversation with people who believes in his model, like my religion always ends up getting thrown in with these more extreme groups. Like you remember watching the Jubilee episode,
Mm-hmm.
like John Dehlin did that. He said he listed off, People's Temple and a bunch of those like very extreme groups. And then he said, if I thought of all the level of harm that these groups did, and then I think of like the level of harm that the LDS Church has done, it's done more harm than those groups. He said something that like that, which is ridiculous because those groups are so much smaller than our church. You got to look at the rate of harm, and we've done far less harm than those groups when you look at actually the rate than the actual number of members that we have.
Right.
They basically killed off their entire membership in the case of like Jim Jones. But he automatically tried to group us with those crazy groups. And that happens every time that I have these conversations about cult models, is that the LDS Church always ends up getting grouped with these fringe crazy groups that have done terrible things. And so Haasan may not intend that to happen, but it always ends up happening. So there must be something wrong with his model. It must not be nuanced enough if that keeps on happening. And I must say, it's also very interesting that when I hear evangelicals try to use the bite model against us, because Stephen Haasan, he does not like evangelicals at all. And if you look at his tweets, he thinks that the modern evangelical movement meets all the criteria of the bite model. So,
well, I would if you're going to say that our church meets some of the criteria of the bite model, I think it would apply to a lot of Christianity and Catholicism and Islam as well. If you're going to say that, Mormonism falls under a cult.
So if you're going to ask if we meet all the criteria of the bite model, my answer would be that I don't think that any organization meets the criteria of the bite model, because brainwashing and mind control is so central to the model, and because those concepts aren't real, and because they're so central to it, they're the backbone of it. Like it's emotion control, behavior control, like, and the way that
control.
The way he defines control is highly based upon the brainwashing and mind control models. And so once you realize that those aren't real, you realize that no organization actually meets the criteria of his model, because those concepts aren't real. Now, if you were
the
to
foundation
ask,
of his model kind of crumbles in a way if it's all based around brainwashing and control in a way.
Yeah. But now, if you were to take his model and say, does the LDS Church ask, tell, demand its members to do some of those things? Sure, it would meet some of that criteria, but it doesn't control its members to do those things in the way that Haasan defines it.
Right. Okay. Right. Let's keep going.
But yeah, so I say that because whenever I go hard on brainwashing and mind control, quite often the response I'll get is that, okay, yeah, brainwashing and mind control are bunk, but what about all these characteristics of Haasan's model? Like, we can still talk about that, right? The church can still meet all those characteristics. And my answer is, well, no, because the brainwashing and mind control model is so central to his model. And once you realize that no organization actually meets his model. The only exception, I think, would be information control, because that doesn't necessarily involve the control of people. And so we can discuss that. But even then, you have to remember that the goal of a cult model is to distinguish, nefarious organizations from normal organizations, or non-nefarious organizations.
Healthy organizations.
Right. And so even if you can establish that the LDS Church has not been as transparent as it should be, has it been like extra nefarious, more nefarious than your average organization? And I would say no. Like I would say that it's actually been more transparent than your normal organization. Like, show me an organization that has done anything comparable to the Joseph Smith papers. Like, even if you can show that it hasn't been like met the ideals of transparency.
Yeah.
Like, and I would agree that it hasn't.
Yeah.
There have been
historical and maybe financial as well.
Yeah. But like there was a great episode that Garrett Dirkmont did on the Standard of Truth podcast where it was about like what documents should the church share. And he basically said that any trained historian knows that when it comes to large organizations, it's perfectly normal for them to hold on to documents for a very, very long time and then release them later for decades, even for over a century, especially when they started out as very small and didn't have very sophisticated historical department. And then they eventually get bigger and they become more sophisticated. And then they have to kind of vet the documents to make sure they're not forgeries. And then he said that there's some documents that many organizations never release. And he even gave the example of Coca-Cola. He knew a historian that was writing a history of Coca-Cola, and that he knew going in there were some documents that Coca-Cola was not going to let him access. And if that's normal for Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola, unless you're going to argue that Coca-Cola is a cult, then I mean, you don't really have a case here. So you either have to argue that using the information control that either everything is a cult or nothing is a cult by that criteria.
So no, are you saying that really, unless we come up with a better definition, we really shouldn't be using the word cult because it's like it's not well defined and it's really just a pejorative?
If you can use it for something, for a group that's like verifiably harmful and nefarious, I think. But if you're trying to come up with an actual like sophisticated model to try and identify groups.
So for example, like if someone were to ask, like, is Scientology a cult, or the Jehovah Witnesses, you know, you're saying when it comes to maybe groups like that, it's a lot harder to determine.
Yeah, just even when it comes to groups that have done like sketchy things here and there in their past, like every group has done something sketchy in their past. But when it comes to groups that have just been fundamentally nefarious and harmful throughout their existence, like the Branch Davidians, like People's Temple, then yeah, call those a cult.
Mm-hmm.
All you want. But when you try to create like a sophisticated model that is meant to try and like differentiate between nefarious organizations and non-nefarious organizations, like no model has been successful.
And is it because there's an element of subjectivity too? Because if you're trying to be objective, but people might have subjective views, so like you know, people who, for example, leave our church might see it as corrupt or harmful, so therefore they might think, oh, it meets the criteria of a cult, whereas, you know, believing members would say, no, it doesn't meet the criteria. And it's almost in a way your subjective lens or your view in a way, so it's hard to be objective. Like, how does it meet the criteria?
Well, using any model that has been put forward, any cult model, yeah, that's definitely subjective. If we want to be objective, we can use studies that have been published on our church, and we can show that overall, like when we study large populations, that the church is not harmful. Like you can show like instances where people have been harmed, but I've done a presentation on Robert Boylan's channel where I go over like all the studies that have been published on, Mormonism and mental health within the past few decades,
Mm-hmm.
and the vast majority of them are positive.
I know
And
that was
so,
in a chapter in the Light and Truth ladder. I know Jacob Hansen has done work in that as well, and I think that's important because I think we should acknowledge those people who have experienced harm in our religion or others, but you can't just say that it's all harmful or that's the majority. If the majority of the data points to the net positive of it, then
yeah, I mean, if we want to define a cult as something that is a net negative on society and its members, then our religion is not a cult. If that's how you want to define it.
if that's how, and then you need data to back that up. If that's how it's going to be defined, you would need
Yeah.
data to support you saying it falls under a cult. So yeah, it seems like it's not easy with certain religious groups or organizations to lump them into, this is a cult, and it can get into people just calling something they don't like, a group or religion they don't like or has weird beliefs or some things they don't like, a cult.
Yeah. Well, and in my experience, when I do share that data, people just they want to retreat back to the bite model because uh, the church does meet all the criteria the bite model, or at least appears to, and so they can make the church look. It's a lot easier to make the church look bad that way than actually
Yeah.
use more objective criteria by appealing to the data, by showing that the church is actually very positive for its members and society.
Yeah,
Whereas
and
you
even
can,
within the bite
yeah,
model, like I looked at it yesterday, and I didn't count exactly how much the church would meet, but let's just say like maybe around half or so on most of them the church might meet. So it's not every single one on the bite model, but definitely a few. But yeah, I've heard from a lot of ex-Mormon, either TikTokers or content producers, or even podcasts. They often will bring up the bite model and show how the church, meets some of the criteria or characteristics in it.
it's a very lazy way to smear the church because it's not an objective way to evaluate it, as I've
And
already
it's not
highlighted
accepted
here.
by the scholarly community on religious movements. This is basically rejected.
Pretty much.
Okay.
So, um, I want to go over to this is like the last part I want to go over. So,
Right.
The anti-cult movement has been accused of being a danger to religious freedom, not just by me, but by government organizations. So, in 2020, the United States Commission of International Religious Freedom, which is a bipartisan commission of the U.S. federal government, they identified the anti-cult ideology as a major threat to international religious liberty. Um, the anti-cult movement's ability to infringe on the rights of minority religions in the U.S. has been severely weakened since the courts took away the brainwashing defense. However, in Europe and Asia, the brainwashing argument is still admissible in many countries. And the anti-cult movement even has strong lobbying power in these countries, which has resulted in the persecution of several minority religions. This tends to be much more common in highly secular countries like France, which tend to have a lot of animosity towards religion,
Right.
especially of the new religious movements, which are considered weird by society, and by countries where one religion dominates, like Italy or
Hmm.
Russia,
Right.
who see these new religious movements as a threat to their hegemony. And so
I guess when you think
they
about it, like when Christianity was, that movement was first starting and growing, it probably would have been considered a cult because the mainstream religion in Jerusalem would have been Judaism. Um, and seeing the rise of Christianity with this charismatic leader, and even some early Jews criticized the early Christians for some of their secret rituals that only initiates were allowed to participate in. So even Christianity, which is, one of the largest religions in the world, whenever its movement was growing, probably would have been considered because it was a minority religion compared to Judaism.
Yes, and their fellow pagans, like the in the Roman Empire, also made a very similar argument, similar to brainwashing, that these people can't possibly rationally believe in this, and so we got to
Yeah.
come up with some all explanation for why they believe this. It
And in
wasn't
the Gospels,
brainwashing.
that's what the Jews were saying about Jesus. Oh, he's casting out devils because he's filled with the demon as well. So you can
Yes,
see some of that going on, and then like yeah, like with Mormonism, then you could say this was a new religious movement that other Christians might have perceived as a cult with a charismatic leader and new scripture, but it's very similar to the rise of Christianity amongst Judaism and paganism as what you can see in Mormonism in America, spring out from Christianity.
correct. So there is an organization in Europe. It's the acronym is called THECRIS, but the actual name is the European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Cults and Sects. It has members all over Europe, and some of which are secular people who think new religions are a threat to their country's secular norms. It's very common in France. And then others consist of clergy members of dominant religions in countries like Italy or Russia, who are threatened by new religions stealing their members. One prominent member of FECRIS is a man named Alexander Dvorkin. He's a clergy member of the Russian Orthodox Church. He has called our church specifically a coarse neo-pagan occult sect with fairly serious totalitarian tendencies. He played a major role in getting the Jehovah's Witnesses kicked out of Russia, and our church having its ability to proselyte severely restricted in Russia. So this was a few years back, but the Jehovah's Witnesses, like, they were completely kicked out of Russia. And I remember talking to a guy that served his mission in Russia at the time, and he saw like police like breaking into people's homes and dragging them out of their houses. And yeah, it was bad. The Jehovah's Witnesses, they tend to be less conciliatory towards totalitarian governments. They don't vote, they don't serve. If the country has like conscription, they refuse to serve in the military. And so they tend to get in trouble with more totalitarian governments. Like during World War II in Nazi Germany, they were put in concentration camps because of this. And so, yeah, they tend to get in trouble because of that. Whereas our church, we tend to be much more compromising. And so we don't get in as much trouble, even though our right to proselytize was severely restricted in Russia.
Right.
But this is the consequence of the anti-cult movement in places like Asia and Europe. In the U.S., we already went through like all of this in the courts. The anti-cult movement tried to persecute these new religious movements and were basically told to knock it off. And so we already have a very robust case law in our laws to prevent this stuff from happening. But in many places in Europe and Asia, that's not the case. And so the anti-cult movement has been a major threat to the religious freedom of many of these groups. And so this has major consequences to religions like ours. And so a lot of people think, your church is so big, it's so rich, but in a lot of countries, we don't have very many members, and there's only so much the church can do to protect its members in places like Russia, especially since our church is seen as an American church. And so that is only seen as more of a threat than a help to the members in places like Russia, and even in places like China. China has a list of religions that are not allowed to operate in their country, and they use these cult/brainwashing models as the criteria for what religions are acceptable in their country. And so they're using these pseudoscientific concepts as a way to evaluate what religions are acceptable in their countries and which ones are not. So these concepts have real world consequences in places that don't have the same religious freedom protections that the US has.
Right.
And if you want to read more about that, these are some really good articles that go into the kind of the bad things that FECRIS has done in places like Europe and Russia and in China. But that concludes my presentation.
Okay, well, I think this has been really informative and helpful. I guess maybe we could just close. I could just ask a couple of questions that maybe I have, or where listeners have. Well, let me just ask you this question. So one listener asked, can something be a cult even if the organization or the religious group has good intentions but harmful outcomes? What do you think about
That's a difficult question, because I just don't, because I reject cult models like outright. I don't really care if you call it a cult. My attitude more is like, if it's a harmful organization, like fundamentally, and you then I'm cool with you calling it a cult. Um, my problem is that once that starts extending to groups that don't deserve it, and once you start using these models to start stigmatizing groups that don't deserve it, and it starts being used as a tool to justify bigotry against vulnerable groups and people that have been historically stigmatized and are currently stigmatized.
So, a couple questions that I just want to ask, just for clarification. How would you distinguish between a high demand religion versus a cult? Like, what would be your view on that? Distinct, because we both agree, our faith, we're both members of the church. It's you pretty much you devote yourself to the faith, to the gospel, similar to Christianity or Islam. How would you distinguish between a harmful cult versus a high demand religion?
Oh, that's kind of the new term that scholars use, is high demand religion, and it's more all encompassing because it can include groups like ours, as well as the extremely harmful groups like the Branch Davidians, without the stigmatizing effect. And so, I don't know if we really need to differentiate them. That
Mm,
that 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 is the group. That is the term that even new religious movement scholars are okay with using, is high demand religion.
hmm.
And I'm cool with using I'm
Yeah,
cool
I'm
with
cool with
using
it as
that
well.
term, as long as you're not using it as synonymously with uh,
Cult.
cult, or with the cult models. As long as you're using it in the strict sense that, yeah, my religion demands a lot of me. Yeah, I'm fine with that.
And are you happy with the word cult as long as it's not being used in the way that it's used by these cultic scholars, or in the bite model if it's used specifically to some of these harmful religious groups like, um, Heaven's Gate or David Korash's group? Like, are you still happy with the word being used if it's for these obviously harmful ones, or would you rather cult just not be used because it's not really like accepted by the scholarly consensus?
If you can prove that the group is verifiably and fundamentally harmful to its core, I'm cool with you calling it a cult.
Hmm. I guess, well, just a quick follow up to that is like, how would you determine if it's corrupt to the core, without getting into the, say, the founder's mind, or, not knowing their heart? Like, people are complex or conflicted, and, what if there's some partial good motives, but it's, they're killing people or abusing people. Like, those outward signs would signal to people that, well, this is a pretty harmful cult.
Uh, I mean, if there's just no gray area, then call it a cult to your heart's content. Like, uh, Heaven's Gate, that they didn't last very long, and they just all committed suicide. There's really no gray area there. That's just a group that didn't do any good in the world, and they all like just convinced themselves that they needed to commit suicide in order to like ride on some comet that was about to pass Earth. I don't see that's just a fundamentally harmful organization. So just call it a cult to your heart's content. There are some groups that like maybe like used to be really, really harmful, but over time they're still in existence today and have improved. They're not as bad. And so I don't know. Like I don't know. I don't necessarily would mind if you called them a cult, but just
Mm.
try to recognize the nuances there.
And this is a question that a listener had, which I think is a good question. I think I probably know what your answer might be, but the person asked, to what extent can we distinguish between a leader with charisma, a charismatic leader, versus revelation, um, given so many similarities to the charismatic leaders of commonly accepted cults? How do we distinguish between Joe Smith being a true or a false prophet? Like, how do we distinguish between him being, one of these charismatic leaders, or as some might say, a cult leader, versus a prophet if he meets some of those traits? Like, if you were to meet Joseph on the street, how could you distinguish him between a charismatic leader of a cult and a prophet?
Well, I mean, cult study scholars claim that they don't really care about the truthfulness of the the religion. Like their mantra is they care about deeds, not creeds. They care about whether the religion is harmful or not.
Hmm.
And so the truthfulness isn't really relevant to this discussion. But hey, um, he Joseph Smith could have done some. He could have done some things that lined up with the bite model, and he could still be true,
Mm-hmm.
a true prophet. Which I don't believe in the bite model, anyways. So who cares if he lined up with the bite model?
Right.
So I kind of reject the premise of the question, anyways. So
Right. I'm trying to think if I've got any more questions to ask on this, because it seems that, like what do you think? Why do you think people will call the church, for example, a cult? Like, do you think it's in a way to just disparage it, or to validate them leaving, or maybe they do genuinely feel that way about leaving, but it's somewhat subjective in a way? Like, why do you think people? Because I don't know if, whenever I stepped away from the church, I don't know if I ever publicly said I was in a cult, but I probably like thought that way a little bit. But why do you think people like to point that criticism to members of the church?
well, it's a group that is considered weird by the rest of society, and so that's typically one of the criteria that a group needs to be considered a cult.
Hmm.
Um, for the brainwashing, mind control accusation specifically, I think that it's a very convenient explanation for people who leave the church because they they once believed in this stuff, now they don't. They need an explanation for why. How could I have believed in something that I now consider to be so ridiculous? Um, and it's a very convenient explanation. Oh, I was being brainwashed.
Right.
Um, that's
and
a
and it
it's a
and it makes the organization. It's one thing to say that, oh, I don't believe in the teachings or the truth claims of the religion I was in, but that's another thing to say that I was in a harmful organization or cult. It just makes it more corrupt or more sinister in a way, and I guess it can make you feel more like a victim in a way.
yeah. I honestly think that exposure to the anti-cult ideology just breeds more of a victim mentality among people.
And would you feel that, because you obviously acknowledge, and I acknowledge, that there are these harmful religious groups that have done a lot of damage, like the ones we've listed. If, for example, the data began to support, say, our church, for example, being net harmful, or we found out that the apostles are sacrificing children, something crazy like that, then you may be open to, like, okay, this might fall more under the category of a cult that has really harmful, sinister motives. But until that can be demonstrated through like data, you're saying that we shouldn't be using that word for both our church or other religious groups?
Sure. And I don't, and I'm not really committed to that definition of a cult. Like I'm just okay with you calling it a cult if you can prove that it's fundamentally harmful, because the word cult has just such a strong punch to it, strong connotation to it, that when you encounter a group that is so evil and harmful, that calling it a cult just is very appropriate. And so I'm just okay with people using that. I don't think that like you need to call it that, but it's just an appropriate term.
Yeah, it's kind of a pejorative, and usually what people mean is it's got sinister motives and it's controlling and harmful, I think, is what people mean when they say cult, but there's not a clear definition. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up? I think that's pretty much all the questions I have.
No, I think I've said everything I need to say.
Okay, well, I think this has been an interesting conversation. I'll also maybe link in the description resources for people to check out more, and also link some of your other episodes you've done. But I found this quite enlightening as well to learn more about this topic as well. And thanks for coming on, and best of luck with your channel as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. And listeners as well, if you've been watching, give this a like, share with other people, comment your thoughts as well, and don't forget to subscribe. And you can also donate via PayPal or Patreon as well. And we'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.